that later. We are going to have a poll question about translation services. So I am going to, on that note, we have our MC today, Dion Detouf, and I'm going to, from WCS, thank you for taking on that role. I'm going to turn it over to her for running the meeting.
Great, thank you, Caroline. Hi, everybody. So I'm Diane from WCS, and thank you for joining today our CMP meeting. For the first hour, we'll hear from Sheila, Claire, and Rosamira about effectiveness initiative and the Proyecto Titi. And then we'll hear some initiatives updates after that. So I think our first presentation is on the effectiveness initiatives. So I'm going to hand it over to Sheila and Claire to talk about this.
Thanks so much. I'm going to just share my screen if that's okay.
Yep.
For those of you who don't know me, my name is Claire Elton. I'm with Durrell. I am co-leading this initiative with Sheila O'Connor. I'm sure you all know her. So Sheila's going to chip in if I forget anything important. Essentially, our learning initiative it's titled the Conservation Standards Effectiveness and Impact Initiative, and it aims to answer the age-old question around what evidence is there that applying the conservation standards delivers more efficient and more effective conservation, leading to greater impact. And during the course of this initiative, we actually decided we weren't going to focus only on the conservation standards. We were going to look at any other conservation-focused adaptive management framework. So we are asking this question not only of the conservation standards, but any equivalent approach as well. So our initiative aims to test this assumption over here, associated with goal 1 of CMP strategic plan. So does adopting the conservation standards actually lead to more effective and agile conservation? And does it lead to our ultimate outcome of benefiting biodiversity? So that's the question. It's quite a big and complex question. But essentially, we are building on from some of the work that Making the Business Case initiative did last year, as well as our conservation audits working group. So we've got 3 main aims: to review and understand the best ways of measuring the effectiveness of applying the conservation standards or any conservation adaptive management framework. We're hoping to seek evidence of the effectiveness of applying those frameworks. So what evidence already exists out there, and what type of evidence is it? Is it anecdotal? Is it scientific? Is it robust? Is it qualitative? So we're trying to assess the type of evidence. And hopefully, because this is such a complicated question, hopefully we can figure out a way to develop a long-term research project that would essentially address the question of impact. Does applying the conservation standards, or does applying one of these types of frameworks lead to better impact at the end of the day? So I'm just going to go back to this diagram here. Essentially what we started with is this theory of change, and what we thought we would do is we would pull these 2 results apart and try and figure out what happens in between these things. So what key results are possibly missing from this? So we've essentially expanded this theory of change. I'm going to show you our draft version in a second, but just a quick disclaimer, this draft version is not finalized. It's not perfect. I suppose none of these models are perfect, but we are very open to your comments, your thoughts, your critiques. They can be as vicious as you like. We won't be offended. We've got it all sitting on Mural at the moment, so I will share the link to our Mural, and you can go in at your own time and you can add as many vicious comments as you like. There can be positive comments as well. We don't mind. So if key organizations implement good conservation practice, then hopefully we would see things like increased adoption of a standard language using a sort of precise or standard lexicon, and hopefully we would see increased use of robust scientific evidence. So hopefully that means that the quality of evidence improves and evidence is used more frequently in decision making. In addition, we hope to see a number of other results, and this might look very familiar to you all, because it's sort of 5 big chunks of work around better understanding of conservation situations, better project planning, better efficiency of implementation, better adaptive management, and better sharing and learning. And this is in a nice cycle form, so again, it's probably quite familiar to all of you. And we've tried to identify some of those key results within each of these group boxes. But again, this is definitely not exhaustive, and I'm sure there are things missing. But see, these are some of the main results that we hope we would see happen. The reason it's not in a sort of sequential step-by-step format is because we understand that an organization adopting a framework like this may not see all of these things happen simultaneously or sequentially. We might see some of these things improving within an organization or within a project, and that might already lead to improved effectiveness. So some of these or all of these results may materialize over the course of the project. Somebody may need to mute themselves just because it's a little distracting. So then hopefully this leads to global conservation projects becoming more effective and more efficient. So these are things like increased achievement of planned results, less failure in conservation, and if there is failure, obviously more learning, increased scale up of strategies that we found to be effective, and improved sustainability of our actions and results. And in addition, hopefully we'd like to see increased funding and capacity and increased transparency and accountability. So we want to see increased stakeholder trust within the project and improved stakeholder responsibility, which then hopefully feeds back to improved credibility, which feeds back into funding and capacity. You'll see a lot of these arrows are bidirectional because a lot of these things are happening simultaneously and sort of supporting each other. And if we see this, hopefully then that means that we've got our ultimate outcomes of benefiting both biodiversity, human well-being, and reducing the threats to those particular things. So this is our very complex draft theory of change. What we've done next is we've tried to identify some barriers and some trade-offs. So what are the barriers that we might see if, what are the barriers we might see even if someone is implementing good conservation practice? We might not see more effective conservation. Why might that be? So we've tried to document some of those thoughts as well around barriers and particular trade-offs to adopting an approach like this. So then what we wanted to do, this is our sort of simplified model. What we wanted to do was identify some key measures of success. How can we measure whether these results are materializing or not, or improving or not? So for example, when it comes to better project planning, perhaps one particular indicator could be the presence or the absence of a theory of change. So that is one way we can measure whether the project is better planned, if the team has used a theory of change, if they've documented those assumptions, and if they're adapting their thinking through the use of a theory of change. We also have our conservation audit tool, which might show improvement in conservation practice across a number of these different results. So we identify that as a key indicator. And we also looked into other sectors and how other organizations or businesses might have measured some of these results within their sectors. So for example, we've got papers that have looked at increased transparency and accountability within an organization. So there are loads of methods and indicators that organizations have used to test and measure some of these things. So what we're trying to do now is we're trying to link these measures of success to our theory of change so that we can figure out ways in which we can show progress over our theory of change. So this is, at the moment, this is a screenshot of some of our evidence in our evidence library. Essentially, we are consolidating as many resources like scientific publications, case studies, management plans, organizational reports, any historic documents that have investigated aspects of improved effectiveness or improved efficiency after adopting a conservation adaptive management framework, or any sort of business framework that might help us to investigate these questions. So we've got an evidence library, and essentially we are identifying what type of evidence that is, what the key results are within that evidence library, what the type of evidence is it testimonial, is it anecdotal, is it scientific, and then identify some potential indicators we might use to test those results. So our next steps for the next few months are to continue with that evidence collection and data analysis. We're hoping to do a survey, not only of CMP and CCNet members, but also any conservation planners, practitioners, conservation scientists, or conservation evaluators that may be able to help us answer some of these questions around what do we need to see happen in order to see improved effectiveness, improved efficiency in conservation. As I mentioned, we're identifying those methods and indicators, and we are collaborating with a number of different partners. So these are people from IUCN, like CPSG, Wild Team. We're also meeting up with members of the IUCN business unit, hopefully, and we've met with several members that are associated with the Collaboration for Environmental Evidence. So we're trying to pull as many external partners into this as we can, anyone that has this kind of background knowledge associated with measuring conservation effectiveness. And as I mentioned, we are hoping to develop this long-term research proposal so that we can take this question further. So essentially what we're asking for is some help. This is obviously a lot of work, and we are consolidating as many resources that we currently have, case studies, scientific papers, but I'm sure there's a lot more out there that could help us. So our first request is, do you have access to any resources that we can include in our evidence library? Case studies, testimonials, conservation audits that you might have done at your organizations. We can make these anonymous so that your organization's name is not necessarily on the data. But scientific papers, management plans, any organizational reports, again, we can make this anonymous. So anything that's investigated, improved efficiency, effectiveness in conservation, particularly related to using an adaptive management framework. The next question is, do you know of any tools that can help us to measure changes in these results? So these might be tools like the conservation audit tool, which measures improved process. Well, it may not be improved, but change in the process. And hopefully you want to see an improved project plannings. And the audit tool has obviously been designed specifically for the conservation standards, but it is useful for anyone sort of implementing adaptive management frameworks. So any tools that measure things like increased stakeholder knowledge or increased stakeholder engagement. So if you know of any tools that might help us, please do share them with myself or Sheila. Do you have time to assist us in sourcing or analyzing any of this evidence? So we've obviously got a backlog of evidence that is sitting waiting to be analyzed. So if you have the time to help us with this initiative, that would be wonderful as well. And then finally, do you have any comments or thoughts that might help improve our theory of change? So again, I'm going to share the link to our mural in the chat. And if you want to go in after this meeting or when you have some time, feel free to add comments, add thoughts, concerns associated with that theory of change. I'm going to hand over to Sheila now in case she's got anything additional to add.
Thanks, Claire. No, I mean that you did a great job presenting it. As Claire said, we're about halfway through. I mean, the time frame on these learning initiatives quite tight. We need to have all our products ready by fairly early in December. So don't hesitate to put up your hand and come help us or send us in the right direction to look for these resources. But that's it from us. We're open for questions and comments. There are some in the chat, which I've been trying to monitor a little bit as well. Anyway, well, I guess we go back to Dion.
Thank you so much, Claire and Sheila. This was great, super interesting. I wonder if, Caroline, do we have time to take some more questions?
Yes. Yeah, we've got another 11 minutes or so. Thank you guys. That was.
Yeah. So does someone have any question for Claire or Sheila? You can raise your hand virtually or with your camera. You can also chat a question.
There is a question in the chat. Nick has asked, I wonder if it should just be about projects, not just be about projects, but also programs and other things at larger scales. So we did investigate this question. I think we decided to think more along the lines of projects and what we would see within a project. But I think in a lot of ways we can scale that up and transfer it to organizational level or to the program level. I don't think we are necessarily restricted to projects. But in terms of the language we used in our theory of change, I think it was more sort of project centered. But I don't know if Sheila, you have any thoughts around that?
Yeah, I mean, I responded, briefly to Nick. I mean, we were using the term project to try and ground ourselves, I think, which is, but in our discussion so far, especially with the working group, we did say that we felt things were scalable, that you could apply the same theory of change or the same thinking at larger scales, even at organizational level. So I hope that helps, Nick. Who do we send resources to, Claire or Sheila? Probably Claire, since she's been responsible for getting everything into that resource library. But, yes, I would say send them to Claire. Sorry, Claire, throwing it at you.
I just put my email in the chat in case anyone wants to share resources.
Yes, thank you for that. Any other question?
Yeah, I had a question. This is Christina Cacoyanis from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. First of all, I think this is great. A number of elements in the theory of change are related to whether they're actually implementing kind of the open standards, the conservation standards, or an adaptive management process. The link that you had to, and does this achieve kind of better conservation results, to me that seems like absolutely essential. And I was wondering what % of the kind of the evidence you've collected so far has that. Like, yes, they have implemented, and there is we see that there is some kind of better conservation work that has been done as a result. Do you have any sense of what amount of the evidence that has been collected to date is showing some light on that?
Not a lot. Very, very little quantitative evidence. So we've got a lot of anecdotal evidence that might look more at the impact side of things, but there's very little evidence that currently exists related to that, to biodiversity or human well-being impact. We realize that it's such a big thing to try and assess at the moment. So we sort of put that impact assumption to the side for the moment, and we're probably going to investigate that more next year if we have time, and I can convince Sheila to take the time to do it. But no, there's not a lot of evidence at all that exists associated with impact. But if you have any, or you would like to share some, then please do. Or if you want to get involved in terms of how we can monitor that, so developing a methodology for how might be the best way to measure that assumption, then please get in touch.
Yeah, definitely, I will. Thanks.
And just to add to that, so a couple of papers that jump out at me, Christina, is they both have to do with IUCN species action plans. We can circulate those, but if you look at access the resource library, I can't remember one of them. I know Caroline Lease is the author on, with a number of other people. I can't remember the author and the other ones, but I can send them. We can send them out in some way so that people can look at those.
Thanks.
Cool, thanks, Shalane Claire. And I see that Rachel has a question. Go ahead, Rachel.
Yeah, I also just wanted to chime in on that question. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
So we have ideas on how to get at that longer term impact question. And we've been pitching these, these didn't originate with us. There's various others have been pitching these ideas. One would be the kind of pie in the sky dream research project where we'd actually sort of run, what I envision as almost a randomized controlled trial where you'd identify a set of projects, maybe work with the donor across all the projects in their portfolio and actually randomly assign half of the projects to a conservation standards type approach and half of the projects would continue whatever business as usual type of planning approach. So then that would be sort of the placebo group. And you'd actually track impact over time. But that, of course, that's a long-term study because looking at impacts, you'd want at least a 5 or 10-year time frame for that. So that would be probably a long-term, very expensive study. But that's kind of the dream, the gold standard. Madeline McKinnon had also proposed retroactive analysis, which might be more practical, building on the evidence base that's growing very rapidly for the effectiveness of conservation intervention. So there's a huge growing literature on what kinds of conservation actions are most effective using more rigorous sort of causality-based approaches, trying to tease out causal impact of conservation. Finding some of those studies and trying to figure out retroactively maybe which of those projects might have applied a conservation standards approach or had staff that were trained in the conservation standards, and then using that to kind of, because the evidence base is already there for the effectiveness of those projects, it would be a more feasible study, and it would still take work to try to figure out which had applied a conservation standards approach, but it might be a lot more practical. So I think those two are kind of exciting ideas going forward.
Great, thanks, Rachel.
Great. Anyone else for a question, or should we move on? Oh yes, Will, go ahead.
Hi. So, I mean, it's a really great initiative and also a really difficult topic. So thank you for your efforts on this. And I just wondered if, as you look at other sectors, do you have any ideas as to how other sectors try to work on whether it makes sense to apply these sorts of disciplined or agile processes, whether they're linear or agile, whatever they are, and say that they help to make a difference to their sector, whether you're in, engineering work or IT or whatever it is, and how do they do it? Because it seems to me that in all sectors, it's actually a bit of a challenge.
Yeah, I mean, from what we've seen, it is a bit of a challenge, and nobody's really answered the question holistically. So certain papers that we found from various business sectors or whatever have focused on sort of 1 or 2 key results at a time. So looking at it overall and looking at, I mean, you'd have to define what effectiveness actually means to that particular industry. So it's really complicated to answer the question without sort of making it more specific. So we've sort of pulled apart little pieces like transparency and financial or whatever the case might be, but it's difficult to say overall whether any sector has sort of got a perfect answer for that.
Nick, go ahead. I think you have a question.
Oh, I was just going to respond to Will's question, but I think Claire got most of my answer there, and she's exactly right. A lot of this has to do with what's our metric of success? How do you actually measure success in conservation? And I think there is some interesting movement on looking at sort of standard metrics for how we might measure conservation. So that might, I mean, not to make this initiative even bigger and even scarier, but that's something we might want to think about.
Thanks, thank you. Anyone else or?